If you could imagine with me that our universe is somehow words on a page, that there is an author somewhere writing a story, and he's writing a story that you and I, because we're in it, think of as reality. But it's not. It's real for us, but it's not real. He has somehow created artificial intelligence. And he's telling a tale, and he's writing a story. And somehow that author decides that he wants to get those characters that are in that story out of it and into his reality, into the real world. How's he going to do that? The story of Jesus, if you allow me to extend the metaphor, tells us that God wrote himself into the story as one of the characters. And through that character, makes a way out of the book and into the real world. The title of the sermon is An Unexpected Appearance. John chapter 20, verse 24. Now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them, and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Now, there are three questions that rise out of that passage, this experience that Thomas has with the resurrected Jesus. First of all, why the doubt? Why did Thomas doubt the testimony of his friends? Second, why faith? Why does Jesus seem to praise those who believe without seeing the way Thomas did? And then finally, why the scars? Why was the resurrected Lord scarred? Those are the three questions we're going to be exploring today. We're going to start today with the first. Why the doubt? But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand in his side, I will not believe it." Thomas doubted the story told to him by the other 10 disciples. And like any good scientist today, Thomas made the material request. If you want me to believe that Jesus has risen from the dead, he's going to have to show up in my presence, and I'm going to have to stick my finger in the holes, or else I will not believe. See, Thomas suggests that belief has to be based only on personal experience. But that kind of an approach to knowledge restricts all events in the world to be normal, common, and shared by all. That poses a huge problem for the gospel, and we're going to get into that in the next point. But doubt is valuable, and as dangerous as doubt can be, it's also the vehicle by which Thomas comes to faith in Jesus. It would be unfair to say, of course, that Thomas understood what was happening in front of him any better after he met Jesus than he understood before he met Jesus. But what he couldn't deny when he was there physically in the presence of Jesus was that something unbelievable and unrepeatable and unexpected had happened. And Thomas can name it nothing else than God. And so he looks at Jesus, probably just as ignorant as he was just an hour before. but he says, my Lord and my God, because nobody comes back from the dead. That is Thomas's conviction. It's the conviction of all the disciples. It's the conviction of the ancient world. It's the conviction of ours today. People don't come back from the dead. When Thomas meets him, he knows something has changed. But the thing is that what Thomas required of Jesus, we can't have. Thomas required to see him in the flesh, and that changed everything for him. But you and I, we don't get that experience. So what about us? And that leads us to the question, why faith? Why faith? Jesus said to him, this is in verse 29, because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. See, routine experiences don't require faith. But Jesus himself, and really any historical event that claims the uniqueness of the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus, any kind of an event that would claim to be unique, to be one time only, to use the words of the book of Hebrews, once for all, any event like that can never be provable by the criteria today we require things to be provable by. If it's repeatable, if it's consistent, we can know it. But what about an event that cannot be repeated? How would you ever know it? Our definition of knowledge today says they can't exist. They can't exist. Because when something that never happens, when something that can't happen, when something that only has happened once, when those things occur, the only ones who could have the tangible, physical, sensory experience required for true knowing are those who were there. And the rest of us are only left with their testimony. There's no other way it can be done. If any of us have any chance of knowing anything about those kinds of events, particularly those that occurred before there were movies and pictures, there's no way we could even hear about it apart from eyewitness testimony. The question we have to ask is, were they lying about their experience? That's the question we have to ask. So why would we believe that Thomas really had that experience with Jesus? I mean, sure, somebody wrote it down, but that doesn't make it true, right? Well, we could look at what happened next in the lives of the apostles who claimed to have had this experience. We could look at what occurred in their lives. History tells us that they went out and started sharing the story everywhere they could. That for all of them, it cost them their families. It cost them their reputation in the communities. It cost them their place in the people of Israel. And in the end, many of them were killed for the testimony they brought. We can look at that as evidence as whether or not they really believed what they were saying. That's something. Tradition tells us that Thomas, after this experience, went out and started sharing the gospel and went as far as Persia and India. That's a trip of over 3,000 miles. So we can look at them. We can ask, does their life afterwards bear out the truthfulness of their testimony or not? But that's not where it ends. That's where it begins. We do have to somehow deal with our own personal experience, don't we? At some point, we have to figure into the equation. And so I want to move us beyond a little bit of science, but not beyond objective reasoning. We also have to ask if our experience in our own lives in any way validates Thomas's experience. In other words, has anything in our experience caused us to place greater trust in Thomas's experience that he claims to have had with Jesus? Now, firsthand experience the resurrected Jesus in the flesh. That was unique to those living in first century Israel. You and I will not have that experience till Jesus returns. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, has there been anything that would make the possibility of Jesus' existence seem plausible to us today? Now, I usually am hesitant, believe it or not, to share my own personal experience. But it would be somewhat duplicitous of me to claim that I'm a believer in Jesus simply because I weighed the evidence and it persuaded me that the evidence was in favor of the apostles, and that's really all that I've ever done. Certainly there's evidence, but it's my own experience with the God who calls to us in Jesus. That really is the source of why I stand here today. Maybe that's true with many of you. Let me share just one experience I've had of many. I was a young person, and like young people, full of doubts and questions. And I remember one particular Sunday morning, I don't know if my dad remembers it as well as I do, but I woke up and I said, I'm not going to church. I think I was 16. And my father said, what do you mean you're not going to church? And I said, I'm not going to church today. And he's like, why? And I was a crafty 16-year-old. I said, I don't think God wants me to go to church today. And my dad, ever the patient one, said, what makes you say that? I said, I don't know. I woke up late even though I set my alarm. And we ran out of hot water, and I was slow in my shower. And now if I go, I'm going to be late. It just looks like God doesn't want me to go. My dad was late too. He was heading out. And so my dad, he was good with me. I was 16. He said, well, whatever you think. And he left. And I felt guilty. It was cold. It was in January. And I felt guilty about that, and so I thought, I need to go somewhere. So I thought, I'll go to my grandmother's grave, which I went to often. She was a pillar of faith in our family, and we lost her when I was young, and I missed her very much. And so I would often go there for peace or just to think about God and my own relationship with Him. And so I said, I'll go to my grandmother's grave. What I didn't know was that it was blisteringly cold outside, and the wind was whipping. And I tell you, I drove up and there was so much snow on the ground, I couldn't get into the graveyard with my car, and the gates were closed anyway. So I parked, and I started walking out there, and I thought I was going to die. She was a long walk to her tomb, and I was walking it, and I was freezing. And I brought my devotional with me. At that time, I was going through Oswald Chambers' My Utmost for His Highest, which is still one of my favorite devotionals. And so I was reading, I was flipping it. I had gloves on. I think I have it here if I can find it. So I had gloves on. I had a great difficulty turning the pages, and I wasn't taking them off because it was freezing. I finally got to her grave. I was standing there, and I had a bookmark in the page that I was on, and it was a few days out of date, but I just figured I'd just read that one. And it was January 15th, and it was called, Do You Walk in White? These are the words that I read in the freezing cold, under a blanket of snow, looking at my grandmother's tomb. No one experiences complete sanctification without going through a white funeral, the burial of the old life. If there's never been this crucial moment of change through death, sanctification, being made holy like God, will never be more than an elusive dream. There must be a white funeral, a death with only one resurrection, a resurrection into the life of Jesus Christ. Nothing can defeat a life like this. It has oneness with God for only one purpose, to be a witness for Him. Have you really come to your last days? You've often come to them in your mind, but have you really experienced them? You cannot die or go to your funeral in a mood of excitement. Death means you stop being. You must agree with God and stop being the intensely striving kind of Christian you've been. We avoid the cemetery and continually refuse our own death. You remember where I am when I'm reading this, right? It will not happen by striving, but by yielding to death. It is dying, being baptized into His death. Have you had your white funeral, or are you piously deceiving your own soul? Has there been a point in your life which you now mark as your last day? Is there a place in your life to which you go back in memory with humility and overwhelming gratitude so that you can honestly proclaim, yes, it was then at my white funeral that I made an agreement with God? This is the will of God, your sanctification. 1 Thessalonians 4:3. Once you truly realize this is God's will, you will enter into the process of sanctification as a natural response. Are you willing to experience that white funeral now? Will you agree with Him that this is your last day on earth? The moment of agreement depends on you. That could be coincidental, that I was standing in a graveyard reading that 2 days after I should have read it, on a day I should have been in church. But I think God was at work. In many ways, I wouldn't be here today if not for that moment. What about you? Has he worked in your life? Do you have those moments where he felt so real and the call felt so powerful that maybe in hindsight you've convinced yourself was just nothing? We don't come to church to meet a God who's only here. He's been with us since the day we were born. The only thing the Christian faith can do is give us the language to understand it. Why faith? Our belief in Jesus has to begin with the testimony of those who lived with him, who watched him die, who encountered him after he rose from the dead. It has to begin there because they were there. We were not. There's no other place we can begin. Nothing in our experience could ever reduplicate that moment for them. It was unrepeatable. It was unbelievable. It was unexpected. It had never happened before, will never happen again. They were there. We cannot reduplicate that moment in our own lives. But our consideration of the resurrection of Jesus does not end with their testimony. Somehow we too have to encounter this God, this Jesus, alive and resurrected in our own lives and experiences. That has to happen in some way for their experience to resonate with us. And I can say honestly myself, and I think there are many here in the room who can as well, that we believe Thomas because we've met him too. Why doubt? Doubt is where we all start. Why faith? Because there's no other way to come into contact with an unrepeatable experience than by trusting the one who told you what they saw. Why the scars? This is verse 27, backing up a little bit from where we were. Then he, Jesus, said to Thomas, "Put your fingers here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Is it strange to you that Jesus' resurrected body was scarred? Why did he have scars? We started out thinking about an author writing a story, creating some sort of a virtual universe in which he places real artificial intelligence, and then having a desire to get that intelligence out of the book and into the world. And I said that Jesus, somehow, the Word becoming flesh, is the way that he does that. But God decides somehow that he needs to write himself into the story. Born into a dirt-poor family, born to a virgin, which made it look like he was an illegitimate child. That's how God brought him into the world. Poor, worked as a carpenter, which is a good trade, but not a prestigious one in the ancient world. The Greek people thought that only the lowest of the low classes did manual labor. And that's the world Jesus inhabited for the first 30 years of his life, and he worked as a carpenter. I mean, if you were writing yourself into a story, is that how you would do it? But you see, somehow, God's love for us, there's something that Jesus goes into the story to take us out of the story. And if he's going to take us out of the story, he has to give us some reason to follow him into the real world. Because we need to be able to trust him. And so he writes himself into the story, and he pretty much, if ink is suffering, he takes on every bit of ink this world can offer. And he endures it personally. And then he dies. And then he tears open the fabric of reality and opens a door for that world to enter into the real world. And that's his resurrection from the dead. The scars. Why the scars? Jesus, resurrected, the God Almighty, who is immune to this world and all of its pains, who had never tasted death, who had never tasted suffering or pain or heartache or anything else, has been permanently changed by his love for us. He bears the scars of his love on his flesh forever. And then he says, "Trust me, I know a way out of here." He went to where we are. I know, this world should be better. But he wasn't beautiful. He wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. He was poor and small and scraggly. He had a common job, lived in it for 30 years before he actually went out and did the ministry we find in the Gospels. He had popularity. We have that sometimes. He had hate thrown at him. He was talked about behind his back. He was treated violently, and one of his own closest friends stabbed him in the back. That led to his own death. He was crucified by the most powerful nation on earth in the most sadistic way they could imagine killing somebody at the time. And then he died. That is the God we serve. It doesn't explain why we suffer, but he enters into our suffering. And then through that, he says, having risen from the dead after all that experience, he says to his disciples, "Now will you trust me?" And they say, "Now, yes." And they die for him. What about you? Will you trust him?